A late-night dinner usually ends with a polite keep the change. For Amari Niel, it ended with a massacre. Leaning against a linoleum counter, she was a woman of quiet routine, mahogany skin against a navy dress, white apron tied tight, and rugged combat boots that felt far too heavy for serving coffee. Then the windows of the restaurant didn't just break, they vaporized. In the center of the glass storm sat Baek Morin, the most feared man in the Korean underworld, his charcoal gray suit blooming with a violent, wet crimson. Amari didn't scream. She didn't run. As the hit squad moved in to finish the job, she reached beneath her white apron and pulled a customized sidearm from a hidden thigh holster. What happens when a lowly waitress turns out to be a ghost from the special forces? What happens when the man who owns the city suddenly owes his life to the woman who serves his coffee? The answer is a cold, calculated war of blood and surgical debt. This is the story of the dragon surgeon. The heavy double doors of the kitchen didn't just open, they were kicked off their hinges. The first man through was a wall of muscle and Kevlar, his suppressed submachine gun sweeping the room in a cold, rhythmic arc. Amari didn't wait for him to find his mark. In her left hand, she still gripped a glass coffee carafe, the dark liquid inside still steaming, a remnant of the life she'd been pretending to lead. With a fluid, violent snap of her wrist, she hurled the pot. It shattered against the lead operative's tactical visor, blinding him with a scalding explosion of glass and caffeine. As he roared and stumbled back, Amari dropped into a low, predatory crouch. Her hand didn't go for her waistband or her boots, she reached beneath the lip of the prep table, where a magnetic strip held her true instrument. The sound of the high-caliber handgun clearing its holster was a dry, metallic rasp that cut through the hiss of the kitchen's burst steam pipes. It was a compact, matte black piece of hardware, customized for a grip exactly like hers. By the time the second gunman cleared the doorway, Amari was already a ghost in motion. She fired twice. The suppressed thuds were rhythmic and clinical. The first round caught the center man in the soft gap between his helmet and his vest, the second took the third man in the thigh, dropping him to the wet tile just as he squeezed his trigger. A line of bullet holes stitched across the stainless steel backsplash, inches above Morin's head, but Amari was already closing the distance. She moved with a terrifying economy of motion, sliding over the slick floor like a dancer on ice. She used the momentum of her slide to drive her boot into the wounded man's jaw, silencing his scream before it could alert the perimeter teams outside. The kitchen, once a place of frantic survival, had become her kill box. Morin watched from the floor, his breath whistling through the plastic straw in his throat. From his vantage point, the waitress was gone. In her place stood a shadow in a navy dress, silhouetted by the sparks of a dying light fixture. She stood over the fallen squad, her weapon leveled at the door, her expression as cool and indifferent as the rain hammering against the restaurant windows. She reached down, retrieved the slip of paper she had handed him earlier, now stained with a single drop of his blood, and tucked it into her glove. The tip had been delivered, and it was paid for in lead. The smell of ozone and seared meat hung heavy in the kitchen, a sharp contrast to the copper tang of blood blooming across the checkered tile. Amari didn't slide Morin across the floor so much as she threw him behind the stainless steel prep island just as a burst of gunfire shredded the industrial refrigerator behind them, sending a spray of coolant and shrapnel into the air. Morin's face was no longer the calculated mask of a high-level asset, it was a deepening shade of violet. His throat hitched, a wet, rattling sound that signaled his airway was collapsing. The trauma to his neck, likely a crushed larynx from the initial scuffle, was killing him faster than the gunman ever could. "Stay with me, Morin," Amari commanded, her voice a low, steady anchor amidst the chaos. She didn't reach for a medical kit, she didn't have one. Instead, she swept a hand across the counter, seizing a paring knife and a plastic straw from a half-finished drink. Outside the kitchen doors, the heavy boots of the tactical team crunched over broken glass, their silhouettes ghosting against the frosted panels. She pinned Morin's shoulders down with her knees. With the precision of a woman who had memorized the map of the human body long before she ever learned a menu, she found the cricothyroid membrane. The gunfire intensified, a bullet ricocheting off the hanging copper pots above with a deafening clang, showering them in sparks. Amari didn't flinch. The blade was a silver flash. She made the horizontal incision, a small, controlled burst of crimson following the steel. Morin's hands clawed feebly at her apron, his eyes wide and rolling back into his head as he suffocated. "Don't move," she hissed, more a prayer than an order. She used her pinky finger to maintain the opening, the heat of his life force slick against her skin, and slid the straw into the windpipe. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of the gunman shouting orders outside. Then, a sharp, whistling gasp. Morin's chest heaved, air finally rushing into his starved lungs. The violet hue began to recede from his lips. He looked up at her, a terrifying mixture of gratitude and realization dawning in his eyes. He understood then what the agency already knew: Amari wasn't just his waitress, and she wasn't just his bodyguard. She was the only thing keeping him from the threshold of the afterlife. She wiped the knife on her white apron, leaving a streak of red that looked like a macabre sash. The kitchen doors creaked. The surgery was over, the survival was just beginning. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of an industrial ventilator was the first thing Morin heard, a mechanical ghost of the plastic straw that had saved his life. He opened his eyes to the muted, amber glow of his private estate's medical wing. The air here was filtered, smelling of expensive cedar and sterile saline, a far cry from the rain and cordite of the restaurant. His neck was encased in a soft brace, and every swallow felt like dragging a shard of glass across his throat, but he was alive. He shifted his gaze toward the floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, the storm had broken, leaving the sprawling gardens of his estate bathed in a cold, silver moonlight. Standing by the glass, silhouetted against the dark pines, was the woman. She was no longer wearing the navy blue uniform of a servant. She had traded the apron for a charcoal-gray tactical sweater and dark trousers, her combat boots clicking softly as she turned to face him. The sleek ponytail remained, but the mask of the subservient waitress had been discarded. In its place was a face of terrifying, clinical beauty. To the world, she was a ghost; to his enemies, she was the end. To Morin, she was an angel of death who had reached into the grave and pulled him back. "You're awake," Amari said. Her voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't unkind. It was the sound of a professional checking a ledger. Morin tried to speak, but she raised a hand to stop him. The tracheotomy was successful. My team's surgeon finished the repair. You'll have a scar, but you'll keep your voice. He watched her with a feverish fascination. He had spent his life surrounded by men who used violence like a blunt instrument, loud, messy, and boastful. Amari was different. She had performed a surgical miracle under a hail of lead and then eliminated a professional hit squad with the same detached grace one might use to clear a table. He found himself captivated by the stillness of her hands, the very hands that had been elbow-deep in his blood only hours before. "Who are you?" he mouthed, the words silent and strained. Amari stepped into the light, her dark eyes reflecting nothing but the task at hand. She didn't offer a name or a rank. She simply reached into her pocket and produced the small, blood-stained slip of paper from the restaurant, laying it on the bedside table. "I'm the reason you're going to finish what you started," she replied. She looked at him then, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, perhaps pity, crossing her features before the iron shutter fell again. "Rest, Morin. The hunt isn't over. It's just moved to a larger house." The air in the estate's subterranean gym was thick with the scent of floor wax and old sweat. Morin's captains, 3 men built like granite blocks and scarred by decades of street warfare, circled Amari with the restless energy of wolves sensing an intruder. To them, she was a fluke, a girl in a waitress uniform who had gotten lucky in a chaotic kitchen. They didn't see an operative, they saw a stain on their pride. "The boss thinks you're a miracle," Sato, the eldest, spat. He was a mountain of a man, his knuckles calloused from a lifetime of breaking bone. He tossed a weighted practice blade onto the mat at Amari's feet. "We think you're a liability. This isn't a restaurant, girl. There are no tips here." Amari didn't look at the knife. She stood in the center of the ring, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing so shallow it was almost invisible. She looked small against their bulk, a sliver of shadow in the harsh fluorescent light. From the observation gallery above, Morin watched, his hand resting instinctively against the bandage on his throat. Sato lunged first. It was a calculated strike, designed to pin her and humiliate her. Amari didn't retreat, she dissolved. She moved with a kinetic intelligence that bypassed thought, a blur of charcoal gray that slipped under Sato's guard. With a sound like a dry branch snapping, she drove her palm into his elbow, hyperextending the joint, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the padded wall. The other two didn't wait. They moved in tandem, a pincer maneuver meant to overwhelm her. Amari's expression never shifted. She caught the second man's wrist, her fingers finding the pressure points with surgical cruelty. She spun, using him as a human shield against the third man's kick, before dropping low and sweeping his legs out from under him. Within seconds, the gym fell silent, save for the ragged breathing of the three men on the floor. Amari remained standing in the center, her heart rate undisturbed, her hair still perfectly in place. She hadn't even broken a sweat. She reached down, picked up the practice blade Sato had thrown, and balanced it on her fingertip for a heartbeat before driving it an inch deep into the wooden floor between his splayed fingers. "The next time you test me," she said, her voice a cold, melodic rasp that carried to the gallery, "I won't use a practice blade. And I won't stop at the bone." She turned and looked up at Morin. Their eyes locked, the asset and the protector. He saw the outsider for what she truly was, a weapon of singular, terrifying perfection. The captains didn't challenge her again. They simply watched her leave, their pride bleeding out on the mat. The news hit the underworld like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. On every encrypted screen from the docks to the high-rises, a grainy freeze frame from the restaurant's security feed flickered to life. Condé, the titan of the northern syndicates, had given the woman a name, the Black Ghost. The bounty attached to her head was enough to retire a small army, and within the hour, the city's concrete arteries were pulsing with hunters. "We can't stay at the estate," Amari said, her eyes fixed on the perimeter monitors. "Condé doesn't care about the collateral damage anymore. He's moving his pieces." Morin didn't argue. He climbed into the passenger seat of the matte black Interceptor idling in the garage, his hand gripping the door handle as Amari engaged the ignition. The engine didn't roar, it hummed with a predatory, electric intent. As the reinforced gates slid open, the first of the pursuers appeared, two modified SUVs roaring out of the tree line, their headlights cutting through the midnight mist like the eyes of hungry wolves. Amari floored it. The world outside became a smear of neon and rain as they tore onto the coastal highway. The pursuit was relentless. Condé's men drove with the desperation of those who knew they were chasing a fortune. Bullets began to peck at the rear glass, spiderwebbing the reinforced layers but failing to penetrate. "Hold on," Amari commanded, her voice as level as a horizon line. She didn't just drive, she manipulated the physics of the chase. With a sharp flick of the wheel and a calculated burst of the emergency brake, she drifted the car into a narrow construction bypass. The lead SUV, unable to match her surgical timing, clipped a concrete barrier and flipped, a fountain of orange sparks erupting in the rearview mirror. But the dragon's shadow was long. A second wave of motorcycles emerged from the side streets, weaving through traffic with lethal agility. One rider pulled level, a submachine gun raised toward Morin's window. Amari didn't flinch. She slammed the side of the Interceptor into the bike, grinding metal against metal until the rider was forced into the guardrail, disappearing into the dark surf below. Morin looked at her, the G-force pinning him to the leather seat. In the flashing lights of the city tunnels, her profile looked like it had been carved from obsidian. She wasn't running, she was leading them into a trap of her own making. "They think they're the hunters," she whispered, more to herself than him, as she swerved onto a bridge that led straight into the heart of the industrial district. Let them keep thinking that. The safe house was a derelict shipping office overlooking the harbor, smelling of salt air and old grease. The hum of the city was a distant throb, silenced by the thick, reinforced walls. Amari sat on a crate, the matte black pistol disassembled in her lap, her fingers moving with the mechanical rhythm of a clockmaker. Across from her, Morin sat on a moth-eaten sofa, a bottle of cheap, cold soju gripped in his hand. The green glass sweated against his palm. He poured 2 small cups, the liquid clear and biting. He pushed one toward her. Amari didn't look up from the firing pin she was cleaning, but she paused, the silence stretching between them until it became heavy. Finally, she set the steel component down and took the cup. "To the survivors," Morin rasped, his voice still a ragged echo of its former self. "To the ghosts," Amari corrected. She downed the shot in one motion, the burn of the alcohol hitting her throat like a physical blow. It was the first time he had seen her eyes lose their predatory focus, replaced by a weary, hollow light. Morin leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "My father spent 30 years building an empire so I could be a king. Now I'm just a man hiding in a box, breathing through a scar you gave me." He looked at her, his expression raw. "Why didn't you just let the clock run out at the restaurant? It would have been cleaner for your agency." Amari reassembled the slide of her weapon with a sharp, metallic clack. "Because I know what it's like when the gears stop turning. I was a child when they took me, Morin. They stripped away the girl and left a machine designed to solve problems with a trigger. But machines, they can be reprogrammed. Or they can just break." She looked at her hands, steady, lethal, and scarred. "At the restaurant, for a second, I wasn't an operative. I was just someone who refused to let something break." Morin reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of her glove. He felt the tension in her arm, a coiled spring that never fully unwound. "We are both broken machines, Amari." Reaching for a restart button that might not exist. For the first time, she didn't pull away. The black ghost and the fallen heir sat in the dim light, 2 fractured pieces of a world that only valued them for their utility. The soju was cold, but the blood in their veins felt human again, a slow, shared warmth against the encroaching dark. The grand pavilion hummed with the deceptive serenity of a koi pond, a sea of silk ties and soft-spoken betrayals. This was the peace summit, the moment the underworld's elite gathered to carve up the city like a Christmas roast. Amari moved through the periphery, her charcoal evening gown a second skin that hid a dozen ways to die. Her eyes, however, weren't on the guards or the exits, they were on the crystal flutes of champagne circulating the room. Morin sat at the head of the mahogany table, his neck brace hidden by a high collar, his presence a silent defiance to those who had thought him dead. Beside him, a silver tray held a glass of dark, aged tea. He reached for it, his fingers inches from the rim, when Amari's hand clamped around his wrist. The gesture was sharp enough to draw the eyes of every captain in the room. "The vintage is off, sir," she said, her voice a calm, melodic ice. She took the glass from his hand. She didn't smell it, she looked at the surface tension, noting a faint, oily iridescent sheen that shimmered under the chandeliers, the signature of a neurotoxin known as blue viper. It didn't kill instantly, it paralyzed the vocal cords and respiratory system, mimicking a sudden stroke. It was a coward's weapon, designed to turn a summit into a funeral without a single shot fired. "Clear the room," Morin commanded, his eyes narrowing at Condé across the table. But the poison had already been misted into the ventilation. A light, sweet scent, like jasmine, began to settle over the delegates. Within seconds, a man to Morin's left slumped, his face turning a terrifying, familiar shade of violet. Amari didn't wait for the panic. She lunged for the service station behind her, grabbing a bottle of high-proof vodka and a pouch of activated charcoal she'd stashed in her clutch. She wasn't a waitress now, nor a ghost, she was the surgeon of table 4 once again. She forced a mixture into Morin's mouth before he could inhale a lethal dose, then turned her attention to the man on the floor. With the edge of a silver dessert spoon, she cleared his airway, her movements a blur of clinical violence. She neutralized the toxin in his throat with the precision of a chemist, her hand steady as the first of Condé's men drew their suppressed pistols from beneath the table. "The trap is sprung," she hissed to Morin, her hand sliding into the slit of her gown to find the cold grip of her weapon. The poison piece had shattered. The room was no longer a summit, it was a slaughterhouse, and Amari was the only one who had brought an antidote. The betrayal tasted like salt and rust. It was Jiro, the youngest of Morin's captains, who had pointed them toward Pier 19, claiming a private freighter was waiting to whisk them into international waters. But as the matte black interceptor rolled into the labyrinth of towering steel shipping containers, the heavy silence of the docks felt less like a sanctuary and more like a shroud. "The engine," Amari whispered, her hand hovering over the ignition. "Listen." Morin strained to hear over the idling hum. Above the lapping of the harbor waves, there was a rhythmic, metallic clicking, the sound of dozens of safety catches being disengaged simultaneously. The containers on either side of them didn't just hold cargo, they were the walls of a coffin. "Jiro," Morin rasped, the realization twisting his features more painfully than the scar on his throat. "Don't look for him," Amari said, her eyes scanning the crane lines above. "He's already gone." Suddenly, high-intensity floodlights erupted from the darkness, blinding them in a sterile, white glare. From the shadows of the rusted crates, a small army emerged, led by the heavy, unmistakable silhouettes of Condé's elite tactical squad. They didn't shout demands. They didn't offer a parley. They simply opened fire. The car rocked under the impact of high-velocity rounds. Amari shoved Morin toward the floorboards, her own body a shield. "Out. Now," she commanded, kicking her door open and using the heavy reinforced steel as a portable barricade. The air was instantly thick with the scream of ricochets and the smell of pulverized concrete. Amari fired back, her matte black pistol barking in precise, 3-round bursts that dropped the closest gunman, but the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. They were pinned in a kill box of cold iron and deep shadows. She grabbed Morin by his collar, dragging him toward the narrow gap between 2 red containers. Bullets stitched a line across the asphalt at their heels, kicking up sparks that looked like dying stars. They were trapped at the edge of the world, with the black maw of the Pacific behind them and a wall of lead in front. Amari looked at Morin, her face streaked with grease and the copper smear of a fresh graze on her shoulder. For the first time, she didn't look like a machine. She looked like a woman who had run out of miracles. "I can't stop them all," she admitted, the wind whipping her sleek ponytail into a fraying mess. Morin reached out, his hand steady against her arm. "Then we stop being ghosts," he said, drawing his own weapon, the weighted steel feeling heavy and final in his grip. "And we start being the storm." The scream of the wind off the Pacific was drowned out by the wet thud of a bullet finding its mark. Morin didn't cry out, he simply exhaled a ragged puff of crimson mist and buckled. He slumped against a rusted shipping crate, his hands clutching a jagged wound in his side that pulsed with the rhythmic, terrifying urgency of an arterial strike. "Morin." Amari's voice was a raw fracture in her clinical mask. She caught him before he hit the oil-slicked ground, her knees skidding across the concrete. The kill box was closing in. 3 of Condé's specialists, shadows in heavy tactical gear, emerged from the fog, their boots crunching on broken glass. They moved with the synchronized confidence of predators closing in on a carcass. Amari's world narrowed to 2 impossible tasks, keeping Morin from bleeding out and keeping them both from being executed. She jammed her left thumb into the wound in his side, the heat of his blood soaking through her glove, while her right hand leveled her pistol at the approaching line. The first man lunged, his combat knife a silver arc in the moonlight. Amari didn't rise. She stayed anchored to Morin's side, pivoting her torso with a violent snap. She fired twice, the rounds catching the attacker in the throat and chest before he could finish his swing. He collapsed into a heap of Kevlar and dying gasps, but the other two were already on her. She was a whirlwind of desperate, stationary violence. As the second man tried to pin her shoulder, she drove the heel of her boot into his kneecap and followed with a brutal, one-handed elbow to his temple, all while her left hand remained buried in Morin's side, maintaining the pressure that kept his pulse from hitting zero. The third man leveled a shotgun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Amari's pistol was empty. In a single, fluid motion of terrifying athleticism, she swept a fallen tactical blade from the ground with her foot, caught it in the air, and hurled it. The steel buried itself in the man's sternum just as the shotgun discharged into the air, the recoil sending him backward into the black water of the harbor. Silence returned to the docks, save for the frantic, wet whistling of Morin's breath. "Look at me," Amari commanded, her face inches from his. Her eyes were no longer those of a ghost, they were burning with a fierce, human desperation. "You do not stop. You hear me? The machine doesn't break today." She pulled a flare from her tactical belt, her hands shaking with the onset of shock. As the red light hissed into the sky, she leaned her forehead against his, their blood mingling on the cold concrete. She had held the line, but as Morin's grip on her hand slackened, she knew the hardest surgery was yet to come. The industrial district was a graveyard of smoke and twisted metal. Condé, the man who had styled himself a god of the northern syndicates, lay among the wreckage of his shattered ambition, his influence bled dry on the cold harbor concrete. The dragon had been slain not by a rival army, but by a woman who refused to be a ghost and a man who refused to be a victim. As the first gray fingers of dawn touched the horizon, the frantic pulse of the city began to settle into a heavy, exhausted silence. The sirens in the distance were a fading echo, irrelevant to the two figures huddled in the back of a luxury sedan idling at the edge of the pier. Morin sat propped against the leather upholstery, his face pale but his eyes clear. The bandages across his side and throat were fresh, the work of Amari's steady, blood-stained hands during the frantic minutes following the extraction. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a tactical asset or a lucky savior, but as the only person who had ever truly seen the man beneath the charcoal suit. Amari didn't sit in the front seat. She didn't check the perimeter or scan for secondary threats. She sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his, her hands resting quietly in her lap. The matte black pistol was tucked away, and for the first time since the restaurant, her fingers weren't curled into a fist. "The agency called," she said softly, the morning light catching the deep mahogany of her skin. "They want a debot. They want their black ghost back in the box." Morin reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he covered hers. His grip was weak, but his intention was iron. "And what does the woman who saved me want?" Amari turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of a revolution. The old order, the world of masters and servants, of assets and handlers, had burned to ash on the docks. In its place was something new, something fragile and dangerous. "The ghost is dead," she replied, a faint, genuine smile ghosting across her lips. "I think it's time we see what the survivors can build." They looked out over the water together as the sun finally broke the surface, turning the black Pacific into a sea of gold. They were both still broken, held together by scars and sheer will, but they were no longer machines waiting for a command. They were partners, standing at the threshold of a kingdom they would redefine on their own terms. The waitress had finished her shift, and the heir had claimed his throne, the new order had begun.